Stay tuned for Neil Ferguson and the symbiotic relationship between China and America.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
The financial crisis raises fundamental ethical questions about the distribution of wealth in society and about the government's or the market's role. We hope you enjoy the program.
It's a huge pleasure to be back here. I think some 2 years since my last visit. 2 years ago I talked about my book, The War of the World, which was an explanation, I think an explanation of mid-20th century conflict. One of the arguments that I made was that there were three things that determined the timing and location of extreme organized lethal violence in the mid-20th century. Empires in decline, that's a subject I've written about in other places, ethnic disintegration, and economic volatility. And 2 years ago I was able to say we may have one and we may have two, but fortunately we don't have three yet. At that time I was also quite regularly speaking at meetings organized by investment banks. You remember what they were, don't you? And the theme of my talks in mid-2006 and early 2007 was the possibility, indeed the probability, of a liquidity crisis striking highly leveraged financial institutions and causing the kind of financial crisis that hadn't been seen in more than a generation. I wrote a number of pieces and gave a number of talks on this theme. What most impressed me was the extreme reluctance of anybody in the financial world to take this scenario seriously. At that time, 2 years ago, the conventional wisdom on Wall Street and in the City of London was that we were living through what Ben Bernanke called the Great Moderation, the death of volatility. Risk had been allocated to those best able to bear it. This time it really was different. And my approach to the problem was to say, financial history will prove you wrong. You only believe this because you're basing your assessment on your own experience. And that is too small a data set. Even if you've had 25 years on Wall Street, you cannot imagine what it might be like if a really big liquidity crisis struck. The Ascent of Money is an attempt to provide context for this crisis. It was written in anticipation of the crisis, and I hope that for those of you baffled, or at least somewhat disconcerted by what is happening, it will offer some illumination. It is a layperson's guide to the international financial system, written on the assumption that you can't really understand something until you know where it came from. There's only one equation in the whole book, and it's there to be ridiculed. What I want to do this morning is not to talk through the argument of the book, but rather, because of the nature of this audience, to explore its geopolitical implications. What does it mean when a subprime mortgage crisis, that is to say a crisis in the mortgage market for relatively poor Americans, precipitates a credit crunch, that is to say a major breakdown in trust between financial institutions and a seizure within the credit market, which in turn begets a global financial crisis comparable in its magnitude to the worst recession of the post-war period, perhaps even comparable, who knows, with the Great Depression. What does that mean? Well, there are a number of arguments out there that are relevant here. My friend Fareed Zakaria is riding high in the bestseller list with a book called The Post-American World. Does this accelerate the transition to a post-American world? Many people seem to think so. This, after all, is a financial crisis made in America. One thing seems probable to me, and I'm quoting here Per Steinbrück, the German finance minister, only a month or so ago, the US will lose its status as the superpower of the global financial system. A power, here's a headline from the New York Times last month, a power that may not stay so super, the United States. A shattering moment in America's fall from power. That was The Guardian. The end of hubris, Der Spiegel. It is fast becoming conventional wisdom in the Western media, and one also hears it argued in Asia too. I've just returned from a trip to Singapore, that this crisis implies an acceleration of the decline and fall of the American empire. Richard Holbrooke, only the other day, published an article in Foreign Affairs in which he argued, and I quote, "There is one pattern that comes very close to being a law of history. In the long run, the rise and fall of great nations is driven primarily by their economic strength. Rome, Imperial China, Venice, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, the United Kingdom all had their day, and their international decline followed inexorably from their economic decline." This, of course, is the legacy of Paul Kennedy's great book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, a book that I very much admire, but have had occasion to disagree with over the years. Now, you might expect me to be attracted to this argument, particularly if you read my book, Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, the last chapter of which suggested, and this was published back in 2004, that the principal vulnerability of the United States was not imperial overstretch, excessive military commitments abroad, which you'll recall was Paul Kennedy's argument in 1987, but was internal indebtedness. The fiscal deficit, the current account deficit I suggested in 2004, were among the three deficits that were likely to undermine the American empire. You'll remember the other deficits were the manpower deficit, the chronic inability of Americans to export people, which is a major problem if you're trying to run a global empire, and of course the attention deficit, which has plagued all American interventions overseas with a very few exceptions. However, I'm going to argue somewhat paradoxically this morning that the credit crunch, global financial crisis, or Great Depression, whatever you feel like calling it, that this great economic shock does not necessarily reduce the power of the United States. It may, in fact, have the opposite effect for the simple reason that power is relative. Let me explore this argument a little bit more closely. The first point I want to make to you is that the wrong question is to ask if this represents a decline of the American empire or of American superpower. What we should really ask is whether this crisis portends a decline of what I call Chimerica. Chimerica is a fantasy country that I dreamt up a couple of years ago. It's the economy you get when you add together China plus America. And Chimerica has been in many ways the key to the way in which the world economy has worked in the past 10 years. Increasingly, the US current account deficit, which peaked at around 1% of global output, has been financed by the People's Bank of China. Not exclusively. The Bank of Japan has done some, so have the oil exporters. There have been a number of surplus countries that have helped to contribute to this financing of the American deficit, but China has become in many ways the key. And my argument is that you can't really understand what happened in the global economy in the last 10 years if you don't understand Chimerica. It seems like the perfect marriage. One partner did the saving, and the other partner did the spending. You may know couples like that. The Chinese saved, the Americans spent. For the Chinese, this was advantageous. They had an export market that they could rely upon. From the United States point of view, this was a line of credit at remarkably low interest rates. When 10-year treasuries were trading at 3.5%, the United States was able to borrow at historically low rates despite the fact that its borrowings kept going up and up and up. Call it the age of leverage. We've lived through an age of leverage in which the ratio of debt to GDP in the United States, including all forms of debt, public and private, has risen from about 150% to 355%. You can't understand the consumption boom of the last 6 or 7 years, and you certainly can't understand the great leveraging of the last decade or so if you don't understand Chimerica. It was only possible because of what Ben Bernanke called the Asian savings glut. So the big question is whether the financial crisis that began in August of last year threatens Chimerica. If it disrupts the relationship between the United States and the great capital exporting economies, in particular China, then we have a very serious problem indeed. But I'm not entirely sure that it will. But what does this mean geopolitically? Does this fundamentally alter the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world? That seems to me to be the big question. If the United States is turning Japanese, if it's about to experience what Japan experienced in the 1990s, zero interest rates, an explosion in public debt, but oh dear, Keynesianism doesn't really work, very low growth, perhaps even no growth over the decade, does that portend an acceleration of the decline of the United States? Well, there are 3 reasons why it's plausible to think that it does. 3 reasons that I hear people put forward when they're claiming that this is the end of American superpower. One is just that this represents a loss of credibility. The Washington Consensus is dead. The American model of deregulated financial markets has been discredited, literally. This, I suppose, is an argument most commonly made in Western Europe. The second argument that one hears is that this will accelerate what's sometimes called the Great Reconvergence. That is to say, it will accelerate the closing of the gap between the United States and the big, rapidly industrializing countries, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and particularly China. Goldman Sachs, some years ago, under the direction of their excellent Mancunian economist Jim O'Neill, produced a report, the BRICS report, that forecast that China's gross domestic product would equal that of the United States in around 2040. A few years ago, I think 2 years ago, O'Neill and his colleagues revised their projections of growth and concluded that the sorpasso, to use an Italian term, the moment at which China overtakes the United States, could come as soon as 2027. Is it not reasonable, therefore, to assume that the credit crunch, that the financial crisis, will bring that date still nearer? If the United States is condemned to a decade of 1% per annum growth, and China can still manage, let us say, conservatively 6 or 7% per annum growth, could the sorpasso come as soon as 2020 or 2019, perhaps within a decade? It seems a reasonable probability if you believe that growth rates can be projected forward in that kind of way. A third possibility, which is worth exploring, a third reason why the United States might be in serious trouble, is the idea that the dollar is going to lose its status as the reserve currency. It's been crucial for the United States that it's been able to borrow in the international reserve currency because it's given it an advantage over other sovereign borrowers. But history tells us a very simple story, particularly British history. No reserve currency lasts forever. 100 years ago, the pound was the principal international reserve currency. Its painful decline and fall from close to $5 at one time to a near parity in the early 1980s, that is a story of the decline and fall of a reserve currency. It could happen to a currency near you. So these are the 3 arguments that I hear that have some substance to them. One, this is a crisis that discredits the United States as a purveyor of economic ideology. 2, it's a crisis that accelerates the convergence of particularly Chinese and American GDP. And 3, it's a crisis that threatens the status of the dollar as a reserve currency. Well, I want to suggest to you 6 reasons why this may not, in fact, work out the way the forecasts of decline anticipate. 6 arguments, if you like, against American suicide, or at least against American depression. The first point to notice is that for the United States to contend with a financial crisis on this scale is fiscally possible. That is to say that even a $2 trillion deficit, let's assume the worst, the largest imaginable deficit in peacetime next year, to finance not only the bailout but also an enormous stimulus package. This can be financed, it seems to me, because the debt to GDP ratio of the United States is by no means the highest in the world as things stand. If you include only that debt which is in public hands as opposed to in the hands of government agencies, it's still less than 50% of GDP. And an addition of another, let's say, 10% of GDP is conceivably affordable. It's affordable, but there's a caveat. Assuming the rest of the world is willing to absorb a continued, indeed accelerated issuance of American government debt. The second, and in many ways crucial point, is that it's all relative. It's relatively easier for the United States to finance this kind of a deficit than it is for European countries. And what is not generally acknowledged here or in Europe is that the crisis is worse for Europe than for the United States. Why is that? Well, first, it's because the banking problems that we've seen in this country are mirrored on the other side of the Atlantic. Indeed, leverage is higher in many European countries' banking systems than it is here, much higher in the case, for example, of Germany. It comes as something of a surprise to realize the extent to which the Europeans currently pointing fingers at the United States have been guilty of exactly the same excesses in their financial markets as went on here. And indeed, in a country like Britain, the degree of imbalance between finance and the rest of the economy is far, far greater than here. It has to be said, and I apologize to any of my countrymen and countrywomen here, that from a purely financial point of view, Great Britain is close to being Great Iceland. The Icelandic story of an excessively large financial system in relation to an underlying economy is in fact quite closely paralleled, but on a larger scale, in the United Kingdom at this point. Switzerland too has an Icelandic character, an enormous financial system relative to the underlying economy. And it's much harder for the Europeans to contend with this crisis because not only are these very large financial systems in arguably worse shape than the American banking system, there is also no European treasury that can finance a $700 billion bailout. Right now, each European country is having to tackle its financial crisis on its own. National treasuries, national financial ministries are coping with this crisis, or rather, not coping with this crisis. So that's the second point. It's not really appreciated how big a problem this is for the Eurozone and indeed for the wider European Union. The third point is that those famous BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, turn out to have been aptly named because they are dropping like bricks. If you look at equity markets, although it's unquestionably the case that this is one of the worst bear markets in the United States in living memory, the stock exchanges of the BRICS have fallen twice as far as the S&P 500 in the year to date, with Russia the worst performer and China and India not far behind. That's important because it seems to me to cast fundamental doubt on the plausibility of the decoupling hypothesis. Now, I always find that word decoupling faintly obscene, but that's possibly because I have a puerile mind. But let's simply assume the thesis that China can walk away from this financial crisis unscathed and continue to maintain a growth rate of at least 6 or 7%. That is the hypothesis of the Great Reconvergence. I'm not persuaded. I'm not persuaded that China is so much less dependent on export markets than it was, say, 10 years ago. Many of the calculations that imply that seem to me to be based on official estimates of the importance of net exports that aren't wholly plausible. The BRICS are dropping, in other words. It's by no means certain that they can avoid a kind of asymmetric shock as the export markets of the developed world suddenly contract. My fourth point is that the great crisis is terrible news for the petro-powers. Remember, some of the biggest thorns in the side of the United States are energy exporters. Russia, Venezuela, and of course Iran. The great credit crunch spells the end of the commodity price boom that peaked in the early part of this year. And as the price of natural gas, and particularly of oil, zooms downwards, I think quite likely to below $50 a barrel, maybe to as low as $25 a barrel, it's game over for the petropowers. It doesn't take much for Venezuela's financial system to teeter on the brink. In fact, as soon as oil fell below $95 a barrel, the finances of Venezuela began to look very problematic. For the other petropowers, the price barrier is a little lower, but not that much lower. Again, it's all relative. It's all relative, but in the end, the relative shock of a great recession, if not a great depression, is greater for energy exporters than for the energy importers, who in fact get a kind of stimulus, a kind of tax cut at the gasoline pump. Is it all over for Chimerica? That's the key, really. Currently, the plans being implemented in Washington are for a bailout and a stimulus package that will take the deficit well north of $1 trillion next year, are predicated on the idea that the rest of the world, and particularly China, will continue to finance that deficit. It certainly can't be financed domestically because the savings simply aren't there. Now, will the Chinese do it or not? Will they continue to be buyers of US treasuries as they have been for the past 5 or 6 years, or not? The possibility exists that they will switch their resources to domestic expansion, to domestic consumption. That seems to be one of the implications of their own stimulus package, which is around about $586 billion worth of stimulus, a very large proportion of Chinese GDP, about 15%. But I don't think it's absolutely certain. In fact, I have deep doubts that the Chinese are really able to walk away from their Chimerican relationship. That is because the export sector remains absolutely crucial to China's economy, and the Chinese themselves have been shocked at the damage that's already been done to that sector by the global slowdown. It seems likely that they've reversed their policy of allowing the Chinese currency gently to appreciate relative to the dollar. In fact, I would anticipate an increase of intervention by the People's Bank of China to halt and maybe even to reverse renminbi appreciation. That is very crucial indeed, because it means they become committed to the accumulation of yet more dollar reserves. News just in. Last month, the Japanese were net sellers of treasuries to the tune of nearly $13 billion, but the Chinese were net buyers to the tune of nearly $50 billion, just last month. So their actions seem to me to be speaking rather louder than their words. I don't see the Chinese walking away from Chimerica. They have too much skin in this game. Did you realize that roughly a fifth of their currency reserves were in the form of the debt of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? If you want a reason for why those institutions were bailed out the way they were, look to Beijing, not to Washington. The Chinese stand to lose more than anybody else from a dollar rout. If the dollar ceases to be a reserve currency and depreciates drastically against Asian currencies, the Chinese will be hurt more than anyone, which is why I think it's highly unlikely they'll let it go. There is a catch. As I've said before, it all hinges on the bond market and China's commitment to it. As I've said, I think the Chinese will stay committed, but there's a possibility that they won't. There's a possibility that they'll opt for what you might call market socialism in one country. And on the 1930s model, we may yet see the last great communist power going its own way and walking away from the Great Depression, having almost no involvement in it. That, after all, was the Soviet experience in the 1930s. There is an argument going on between those who favor the prioritization of growing domestic consumption and those who see China as inextricably, symbiotically linked to the United States. And it is not clear who's going to win this argument. I think those numbers I quoted earlier about Chinese purchases of treasuries were very heartening. That suggests that at least for the time being, the policy hasn't changed. If it had been a different story, if the Chinese had also followed the Japanese example and sold, I would have been very nervous. My sense is that ultimately the proponents of globalization will prevail over the proponents of market socialism in one country for the practical reasons I've given. But I don't think, and this is really the bottom line, I don't think we can take that for granted. So if there is a kind of clear policy recommendation to both Washington and Beijing, it's that. Don't turn away from globalization, and don't be deluded into thinking you can solve this crisis with the old Keynesian nostrums that only worked in the closed economies of the Bretton Woods era, when capital controls were imposed and exchange rates were fixed. We're not in that world now, and it's an illusion to imagine that we can go back to it anytime soon. Watch the bond market, ladies and gentlemen, in the first 100 days of President Obama's administration, and remember the wise words of James Carville, campaign manager to Bill Clinton, back in February 1993, one of my favorite quotations from that era. I used to think if there was reincarnation, Carville told the Wall Street Journal, I wanted to come back as the President or the Pope or a .400 baseball hitter. But now I want to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate everybody. Thank you very much indeed.
We hope this program has been informative and has provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the Voice for Ethics.